Today, we are announcing a capture of another FBI's most wanted top 10 fugitive, Ryan Wedding. That makes 6 top 10 FBI captures in 1 year alone.
Last Friday, FBI Director Kash Patel held a news conference alongside law enforcement from Canada and the US to announce the arrest of Ryan Wedding. The Canadian former Olympic snowboarder is accused of running a transnational drug trafficking ring. He'd been on the run for over a decade.
I did not see this endgame coming.
Colin Freeze covers crime and justice issues for The Globe.
He was, arrested with some degree of fanfare, but no fighting in Mexico a few days ago, and he was immediately spirited away to the United States.
On Monday, Wedding made his first court appearance and pleaded not guilty to federal charges he faces in the US, including charges of murder and drug trafficking. His next court appearance is currently scheduled for March 24th. Today, Colin is on the show. He'll tell us what we know about how Wedding went from being allegedly protected by a Mexican cartel to a California courthouse, and how his extradition raises questions about Mexican and Canadian sovereignty. I'm Cheryl Sutherland, and this is The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. Hi, Colin. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Good to be here.
Just to say, we're talking midday Monday, and Ryan Wedding is expected to appear in court later this evening. So Ryan Wedding, the alleged drug kingpin and FBI fugitive, was arrested recently in Mexico City. What do we know about the arrest?
Very little. There had been a tempo of publicity and notoriety and very public manhunt for Ryan Wedding. And you got a sense over these past few weeks that the circle was closing on him. I don't want to sound like I know the ins and outs of this. I think this is still a developing story, but without any apparent loss of life, without any bullets being fired, a man accused of being a drug kingpin was sort of taken off the table. And so it's a very neat end to a very long saga.
Colin, have we learned anything more about his alleged position in the Sinaloa cartel since his arrest?
Well, I would describe him as Sinaloa adjacent, as opposed to a member of the Sinaloa cartel. For one, he's not Mexican, but I think he was a good earner. I think he was a good sort of adjunct. I think our own law enforcement has described him as a man who had $1 billion a year cocaine enterprise, which sounds like a lot, but it's dwarfed by the amount of money he's made by the Mexican cartels themselves. So he's kind of like a branch plant sort of logistics guy, I think, in the most maybe benign interpretation, who is orchestrating the movements of, Colombian cocaine purchased by the Sinaloas through Mexico up to Los Angeles and across North America to Canada. That I think was his role. That was his niche. There was a lot of stops along the way, and there was a lot of, frankly, murders along the way, according to authorities. So it was, a deadly trade he was engaged in for many years.
And we should also mention these are allegations, of course, as we can't say for sure. But he's allegedly part of this drug cartel. So what charges does he face now and in which jurisdictions?
Ryan Wedding is the subject of a U.S. Department of Justice case that is filed in Los Angeles, California. This case has been put together by the U.S. FBI, but also to one degree or another with considerable help by the Mounties, who would in ordinary circumstances lay charges in Canada. But the way this is worked out or been allowed to work out, it is an FBI-centered case being prosecuted in Los Angeles. The gravest charges Mr. Wedding faces are murder conspiracies, multiple murder or murder attempts in Ontario, also a murder plot against a member of his organization, allegedly, who's turning government witness and who was essentially assassinated in Colombia. So Ryan Wedding is a man accused of multiple murder for hire conspiracies.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's take a moment to talk about Ryan Wedding's alleged associates who have also been apprehended, but here in Canada. Can you tell me who are the major players when we talk about these associates?
The way I see it, this is not a foreign conspiracy. This is largely a Canadian conspiracy that's being alleged here. Even though Ryan Wedding and some people close to him were allegedly, captured in Mexico, there's about a dozen people before Canada's courts accused of being their associates and enablers. It's a sort of fascinating cast of characters. You've got your alleged corrupt Toronto lawyer. You've got your alleged Toronto cryptocurrency broker. You've got your alleged Vancouver cryptocurrency broker. And again, these cryptocurrency guys are accused of moving hundreds of millions of dollars in drug gang profits. You've got a Montreal hitman who's in the mix. You've got violent young man from Toronto who's accused of doing a shooting in Niagara Falls, fatal shooting. And on top of all that, you've got Ryan Wedding's alleged number 2, second in command, who was arrested in Mexico last year and has now been before the U.S. criminal justice system for already for a year. And his name is Andrew Clark, and equally fascinating guy.
What is the latest on these alleged associates? Like, do we know anything about what's going on with their cases?
All I know is that while it's possible for Ryan Wedding to be apprehended in Mexico and on the next flight to Los Angeles within 24 hours, the Canadian justice system does not work like that. I think about 4 people were picked up over a year ago, and an additional 8 people were picked up in Canada just about 2 or 3 months ago. And they're all very much at the outset of their extradition proceedings. Now, in theory, an extradition hearing in Canada is a not onerous hearing. It's not supposed to last forever, but they can go quite a long time. And I think we're a year or possibly years away from sending any of the dozen or so accused to Los Angeles to face trial with Ryan Wedding.
Okay, so for the time being, they're going to be in Canada.
Right. We've just had bail hearings for a bunch of them, the initial bail hearings. So our courts are seized with the question, and they're going to take some months on it as to whether they can be live under house arrest until they have their extradition hearings. But, there's a lot of things to talk about, evidence, how it was obtained, whether it was obtained lawfully, et cetera. That's going to consume the courts for, as I said, many months, possibly years.
The RCMP has described Ryan Wedding's alleged operations as a $1 billion per year business. What happens to that business now?
Well, I'd say Mexican cartels abhor a vacuum. I mean, it is, I don't think the business stops. The drug business is a demand predicated business. And as long as people want to buy the product, people will find ways to satisfy that demand. So will cocaine still get from Colombia to Mexico to the streets of Toronto? I assume it will. Will they have different intermediaries and conduits and routes? I think so. Ryan Wedding was not Canada's only cocaine dealer. He was, as he's accused of being, he's a man with some notoriety in that realm, but he was far from the only one. So I think the drugs will find a way. I think what this case has shown, broadly speaking, is that Canada is home to this alleged underworld of enablers and associates who, even if they're not directly involved in the cocaine trafficking themselves, they are sort of a secondary order of professionals who reap riches off of its trade, right? So if, and without prejudicing the hearings of anybody who hasn't had a hearing yet, the trade itself demands participation from money launderers and heavies like hitmen and people who may be useful around the edges of that enterprise to keep people out of trouble or get people into the depths of trouble from which they'll never emerge. I mean, it's a brutal business, insanely profitable, insanely high risk, high rewards sort of business for anybody who's engaged in that. And I think the biggest example of that is Ryan Wedding himself.
We'll be right back.
The leaders changing Canadian business don't always make the headlines, but you can change that by voting in the Report on Business Best Executive Awards. For the past 5 years, the Report on Business Best Executive Awards have celebrated Canadian non-CEO leaders helping innovate and push Canada's economy forward. If you know a leader in finance, human resources, tech, operations, sales, and marketing, then share their story and nominate them today. They could be one of 50 winners of this year's Report on Business Best Executive Awards. Nominate a Best Executive at tgam.ca/bestexec. The nomination deadline is January 31st.
So, Colin, can you remind us of the law enforcement agencies that have been involved in capturing Ryan Wedding?
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, it's because remember, all laws are structured nationally. They generally, Canada has a criminal code, U.S. has a code. The laws traditionally are enforceable within borders. There's ways around that, of course. Extradition being one of them, which is the standard centuries-old compact where country A and country B say, okay, you don't send your guys into my country to get your bad guys, and I won't send my guys into your country to get my bad guys. We'll work through each other's police, we'll work through each other's lawyers, and we'll have this process known as extradition to get a guy out of jurisdiction A and put him on trial jurisdiction B. But, I think in the Ryan Wedding example, it's one of the closest cooperations between the RCMP and the FBI we've seen in recent memory. And it goes back years. It's not particular to the current U.S. administration, but I think a couple of years ago, essentially, there was some FBI people in Los Angeles who came to see Ryan Wedding not just as a cocaine trafficker, but as one of the big cogs in this continental machine, and maybe also alleging he was an exceptionally violent one. So they turned to Canadian liaison officers posted in Los Angeles to help them. And so the Mounties developed a close partnership with the FBI. But then as the investigation grew, it went to other places like Colombia, where there was a particularly brutal murder conspiracy hatched last year. Facets of it went to Italy and England, where luxury car dealers allegedly helped Mr. Wedding buy his luxury goods because, Wedding was reputationally, he's a large and life figure who was, according to U.S. justice officials and Treasury officials, buying a car that was worth $13 million, buying a fleet of motorcycle bikes, dealing in bulk cash and maybe moving hundreds of millions of dollars in cryptocurrency. So, apart from the arrest of Mr. Wedding himself, there is a global run on his assets to see where they are and see if they could be intercepted, because these are no small amount of assets that are being alleged here.
So some legal experts have concerns about the way Ryan Wedding was apprehended. What are the concerns?
Well, I think the best way you can sort of imagine these concerns is that when we had all of Ryan Wedding's associates arrested in Canada over the past year or so, I'm going to say a dozen, what happened? Well, U.S. prosecutors talked to our prosecutors. They filed some papers in court saying, hey, this is the case we want to prosecute them on in Los Angeles. Now, Canadian police, go out here, do your thing. Here's a judicially authorized provisional extradition warrant. Go arrest them. Go give them extradition hearings, and we'll see them in Los Angeles maybe a year or two's time if it all works out. It might take quite a bit longer. But that's not what happened in Mexico. Mexican officials have basically said he walked up to the U.S. Embassy and said, okay, guys, I'm ready to get on that plane. We do know that the FBI was effusively praising the FBI hostage rescue team, which is a little bit of a misnomer. The HRT is a sort of has a dual role, as I understand it, as a counterterrorism force, and may have played a role in the spiriting Maduro out of Venezuela a few weeks ago. This operation was not a snatch and grab by the looks of this. This looks like the FBI somehow exerted pressure on Wedding directly, or was allowed to exert pressure on Wedding through his intermediaries. And I don't know how that cake was baked exactly at this point, but you sort of have the FBI forcing an outcome here in Mexico that resulted in Ryan Wedding being on the ground in California within 24 hours of cuffs being placed on him, which is a pretty unconventional outcome. And, it's all high fives all around for law enforcement. But I do think there is maybe a second or third order concern here. And you're hearing it in Mexico, and that this wasn't a one-off. Ryan Wedding's number two, his 2IC, Andrew Clark, was kind of similarly spirited out of Mexico in the first days of the Trump administration. Again, no extradition hearings, no process, no law courts at all. So it is this sort of holus bolus handover of crime gang leaders from one justice system to the other, which is unconventional and noteworthy, I would say.
I have a question about the fact that the FBI has really taken the lead on this case. Like we've mentioned, the RCMP and Mexican authorities are all involved. Why have the RCMP and Mexican authorities kind of let appears to let the FBI take the lead?
If you look at the broad history of Ryan Wedding, and my colleagues, Tutan Ha, Mike Hager, Eric Andrew G, have all written sort of retrospectives of periods of his life, Canadian police would have a go, and he would elude them largely. And U.S. police did get him about 15 years ago, and I think he served a 4-year term when he was a much smaller cocaine dealer. And then he sort of disappears for most of the last decade, and then he becomes a really big thing. So I think it's in that context that all I know about is what I've read in court documents, but I think the FBI reaches out to the RCMP and says, hey, this Wedding guy still out there getting big, we need your help. And so it's quite complex, because there is a parallel investigation into Ryan Wedding in Canada, but Ryan Wedding, remember, is not just allegedly shipping cocaine, he's alleging murdering people in Canada. And I think there's, several bodies to attest to the fact that somebody got murdered. That you sort of see this weird spectacle where you have a Canadian hitman, for lack of a better word, who's being hired by somebody who's alleged to be Wedding or one of his people, doing crimes in Canada. That some of these charges in Los Angeles are that, Wedding or his number two, Andrew Clark, hired guys in Ontario, Canada to do a shooting, and people got killed dead because of it. So the murder conspiracies were not charged in Canada in this instance. The conspiracy charges were charged in Los Angeles. So
how does that work? Can you explain it to me? That's interesting.
Right. So I think I ran this by Mountie at one point. He's like, look, we're not forum shopping here, is what he said. There's transnational collaborations. And I think the way this was expressed to me is that the jurisdiction with the best evidence will prosecute the case. Right. Oh. And there's no question the U.S. has developed some phenomenal evidence to show in court one day. They have seized phones. They have very significant conversations that people wrote with their thumbs about making sure somebody ended up dead. The U.S. has developed more than once cooperating witnesses in their efforts to take down Wedding. But those cooperating witnesses were developed with at least one instance with Canada's help. That's the guy who ended up dead in Colombia last year. He was essentially loaned by the FBI to the RCMP to do a little surveillance operation. That's also in court documents. So you see this incredible sharing of information and assets and forms of evidence between the RCMP and FBI, where basically the border is not an impediment to those sorts of things. Shared operations, shared investigations, shared tangents, shared arrest strategies. It's quite something to see the two criminal justice systems work in this complementary way, but there's also areas where the systems are not going to be so compatible, right? There's places the Americans may want to take things that Canada cannot necessarily go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what does that mean for prosecuting crimes that were committed in Canada? I think I'm understanding that it's just that the U.S. is taking the lead in the prosecution. Is that correct? So even if there's something that was allegedly committed in Canada, that will be prosecuted in the U.S.
Right. Well, I should probably back up and explain that murder conspiracy is not a crime that is limited to by geography, right? So, okay. So I think in both Canada and the United States, a murder conspiracy that occurs extraterritorially or out of jurisdiction still prosecutable if the crime sort of crosses the jurisdiction you're in. And I think so. Murder conspiracy is one of those heinous and rare crimes where it doesn't fundamentally matter where in the world it happens. You can put that in your local court. The fact that there's, people who have been shot dead in Ontario, no impediment in Los Angeles to putting Wedding gang and Mr. Wedding himself on trial for those conspiracies. So there's a category of crimes that are held to be so heinous, so loathsome that it's decided in both the Canadian and U.S. criminal justice systems that we're not going to let the fact that all or some of this happened outside our borders be a major limitation, right? So.
Okay. There was a lot of rhetoric around the interagency collaboration that led to this arrest and its impacts on sovereignty. Can you explain why? Like, why is there a concern around sovereignty?
Well, I think Canadians, in Canada, our justice system is not, we haven't had to bend so far as the Mexican system has had to bend, I think, in the last number of years, and I think maybe you would have to look at just how much of a presence the cartels got in Mexico, how big they got, that they seem to be a de facto control. I mean, Donald Trump has alleged that the president of Mexico doesn't control Mexico, the cartels control Mexico. Now that's a bit overblown, but I think there was a notion that the profits that come and the weaponry that comes from the cocaine trade had made the cartels so big, so intractable, so corrupting that the Mexican criminal justice system could not bring them to heel anymore, which is why, and you started to see where we are today, which is that the U.S. is increasingly pressuring Mexico to solve the cartel problem, or if they don't, the U.S. is going to do it for them. And what Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, has been trying to do is keep U.S. boots off the ground. She denounced the Maduro snatch and grab operation. She does not want the U.S. Army in her country, and most countries do not want another army in their country. But these are some of the pressures we're seeing under the current administration, but it also predates it. It's just that the cartels are essentially Fortune 500 companies in terms of their scale and growth, and how you fight that may be a different kind of paradigm altogether. I mean, the Trump administration has designated cartels to be terrorist organizations. It has designated fentanyl to be a weapon of mass destruction. Canada, which, and I've raised this issue, has also designated the cartel to be terrorist organizations, the 7 cartels to be terrorist organizations. So there is this new sort of semi-militarized intelligence world, law enforcement approach to taking on the cartels that is happening. And I think that raises a variety of sovereignty issues eventually. But I think from a security standpoint, the idea being, as crime goes transnational, so must we. And we'll see where that goes.
Yeah. So we've heard from Mexico on the sovereignty issue. Has Canada said anything about it?
Canada has not said, well, Canada's had some issues with the Maduro operation that occurred earlier this month. But in terms of, the FBI coming into our country, I don't know that to be an issue at this point. In terms of any envisioning of end runs around extradition processes, I don't know that to be an issue at this point. In fact, the RCMP Commissioner Mike DeHaan has been at Kash Patel and Pam Bondi's side a couple of times, Pam Bondi being the Attorney General of the United States. So I think Canada's got a seat at the table. And, you can ask our Prime Minister about the value of having a seat at the table, because I think it means that the RCMP has helped steering outcomes in a way that the U.S. would regard as favorable, and that may be seen as a useful thing to do at this time. And these are legitimate issues. I'm not suggesting the politics is playing over much a role here. I think the RCMP commissioners, when he was asked about whether he would like to see the wedding gang associates removed from Canada, he said, I would make that happen tomorrow if I could, but he can't, because we have a criminal justice system here that will make sure that they're not frivolously handed over to the United States.
Colin, just lastly, this has been a really sensational story. What will you be watching for as this continues to unfold? Well, I think,
the first order of business will be what, Ryan Wedding is about to appear in a U.S. court in Los Angeles. That'll be interesting. We're hours away from that right now. We're going to have to see what that means for the dozen or so people who are in his ambit in Canada still trying to. We'll see. Will they be extradited to the United States? Will they? What sentence will they face? What sort of arguments will they raise? How much will they use Canada's court system to pry into tricky questions about how the evidence was gathered? On top of that, it's going to be interesting to see what will happen when Mr. Wedding's number 2, who was caught a year ago, Andrew Clark, Canadian Andrew Clark. What is he going to have to? How is he going to answer the same charges he faces? How is he going to respond to the evidence of murder conspiracies that were taken from his phone? Who will these two guys have to look at each other in court at some point? This whole thing is just a real. It's one of the most vivid crime stories and transnational crime stories has ever situated itself in not just one but many courtrooms across the continent, and it really shines a spotlight on this weird, I think, underworld, this deadly underworld, this insanely profitable underworld, which is drug trafficking, and just how far people will go allegedly to enrich themselves at the cost of, at the very least, ruining other people's lives and sometimes ending other people's lives.
Colin, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
That was Colin Freeze, a staff reporter at The Globe who covers crime and justice issues. That's it for today. I'm Cheryl Sutherland. Tiff Lamb produced this episode. Our producers are Madeline White, Michal Stein, and Ali Graham. Our editor is David Crosby. Adrian Chung is our senior producer, and Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks so much for listening.